Listen carefully to this story, because what happened at Sunset Manor will change everything you think you know about secrets. The retirement home was quiet at night, but Margaret could never sleep. At 84, her mind still ran faster than her frail body. She would sit by the window, staring at the moonlit courtyard, whispering to herself. The nurses thought she was losing it, but she wasn't. She was waiting. 2 doors down lived Harold, once a stern, broad-shouldered man, now stooped with age. He kept a secret of his own. Every evening, Harold wrote letters he never mailed, folding them with trembling hands, tucking them into his nightstand drawer. Then came that stormy night, the night everything changed. A blackout cut the power. The generator failed. Hallways went dark. Staff scrambled with flashlights. Margaret, guided by memory more than vision, shuffled down the hall. She knocked on Harold's door. No answer. She pushed it open. Inside, the flickering light of a candle revealed Harold, sitting at his desk, frozen mid-sentence. The letter in front of him read, "I never told you the truth about your husband's death." Margaret's heart stopped. Her hands shook as she picked up the letter. Her husband had died 50 years ago. An accident no one ever explained. "Put that down," Harold's voice cracked. Weak but commanding. Margaret turned, her eyes wide. "What do you know, Harold? Tell me." The storm rattled the windows, thunder rolling like a drumbeat. Harold's chest heaved, his face pale. "He didn't die in the accident," Harold whispered. "I was there. The candle went out. Darkness swallowed the room. Margaret fumbled, her heart racing. Lightning illuminated Harold's chair. Empty. The letter was gone. The next morning, the nurses swore Harold had checked out. His bed was neatly made. His belongings vanished, as if he had never lived there. But in Margaret's nightstand, folded neatly where she kept her prayer book, was the letter. Only now, it ended differently. He didn't die in the accident. He was murdered. And you already know by whom. Margaret stared at the letter for 3 days. Her appetite, gone. Her sleep, fractured by nightmares. The words burned into her vision. And you already know by whom. But she didn't know. How could she? On Thursday morning, a man in an expensive suit appeared at reception. Dr. Vincent Holloway. He introduced himself. Harold's nephew, come to collect his uncle's final effects. The staff apologized profusely. There were no effects. Harold had taken everything when he left. Left? Dr. Holloway's voice was silk over steel. My uncle was dying of pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. He couldn't have walked to the bathroom unassisted, let alone check himself out. Margaret watched from her wheelchair, pretending to doze. She'd heard Harold coughing at night. Yes. But dying? The man who confronted her had seemed weak but lucid, not at death's door. Dr. Holloway's eyes swept the room and landed on her. For a moment that stretched like eternity, they stared at each other. His smile was cold, professional. "Excuse me," he said, approaching. "You're Margaret Winters, aren't you? You were married to James Winters." Her blood turned to ice. "How do you... Your husband worked with my uncle. Construction, wasn't it? Tragic accident at the job site." His voice dropped, though I suppose accident is a relative term. Margaret's fingers clutched the arms of her wheelchair. "What are you saying?" "Nothing at all." Dr. Holloway straightened his tie. "Just that some accidents are more deliberate than others. Have a pleasant day, Mrs. Winters." He walked away, leaving Margaret trembling in the afternoon sunlight. That night, Margaret couldn't bear her room. She wheeled herself down the darkened hallway to Harold's old room. The door stood ajar. Inside, moonlight revealed bare walls and an empty bed, but something glinted under the nightstand. Margaret strained to reach it. A manila envelope, thick with contents. Inside, photographs, black and white, grainy, taken from a distance. The construction site where James had died. Her breath caught. There was James, younger, stronger, talking to a man in a hard hat In the background, another figure watched from the shadows. The timestamp read, 2 hours before the accident. She flipped to the next photo. James again, this time arguing with someone just outside the frame. His face was angry, frightened. The timestamp, 30 minutes before. The final photograph made her gasp. James lay crumpled at the bottom of the scaffolding, but standing above him on the platform was a figure, not trying to help, not calling for assistance, just watching. Margaret squinted at the shadowy form. Something about the posture, the way the person stood, looking for something. She spun around. Dr. Holloway stood in the doorway, no longer wearing his expensive suit. Now he was dressed in work clothes, a hard hat tucked under his arm, the same one from the photographs. "You," Margaret whispered. "You were there." I was 25 then, fresh out of engineering school, working with my Uncle Harold on quality inspections. His voice was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather. "Your husband discovered some irregularities in our reports. Shortcuts we were taking, bribes we were accepting." Margaret's hand shook as she clutched the photographs. "So you killed him?" "I prefer to think of it as solving a problem." Dr. Holloway stepped closer. James was going to the authorities. My uncle and I would have gone to prison. Our families would have been ruined. So we loosened a few bolts on the scaffolding, where we knew he'd be working. Harold knew, Margaret breathed. That's why he was writing letters. That's why he had to disappear. Dr. Holloway's smile was reptilian. Harold developed a conscience in his old age. Started talking about making amends. I couldn't let that happen. Margaret looked around frantically. Where was Harold? What had this monster done to him? "Don't worry about Harold," Dr. Holloway said, reading her thoughts. "He's somewhere safe, somewhere quiet, somewhere he can't hurt anyone with his guilty confessions." Thunder rumbled outside. Margaret realized with growing horror the storm from 3 nights ago was returning. "You're going to kill me too," Margaret said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. Eventually, Dr. Holloway pulled up Harold's old chair and sat down. "But first, I need to know who else Harold might have told. He mentioned you specifically in his last letter, the one he tried to send to the police." Margaret's mind raced. "What letter?" "The one my people intercepted yesterday. Very detailed, very damaging." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Harold was quite thorough about documenting our activities over the years. "Your husband wasn't our only problem, Mrs. Winters." She stared at the envelope, her heart pounding. "How many? Does it matter?" Dr. Holloway shrugged. "Construction is a dangerous business. Accidents happen. Inspectors who don't cooperate sometimes find themselves in precarious positions." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in stark white. In that brief moment, Margaret saw something that made her blood freeze. Harold's walker, folded in the corner behind Dr. Holloway, spattered with something dark. "Harold never left this room, did he?" she whispered. Dr. Holloway followed her gaze and chuckled. "Harold's been here the whole time." In a manner of speaking, he gestured toward the wall behind his chair. "The renovation they did on this wing last month was very convenient. New drywall covers a multitude of sins." Margaret felt bile rise in her throat. Harold was in the wall. He'd been there for days, just feet from where she slept. "You're insane." "I'm practical." Dr. Holloway stood and moved to the window, looking out at the storm. 50 years I've been cleaning up messes, building a respectable life, a successful medical practice, a family. I won't let an old man's guilt destroy everything I've built. Margaret's eyes darted to Harold's nightstand. Earlier, she'd noticed it was slightly askew, as if it had been moved recently. Behind Dr. Holloway's back, she quietly pulled open the drawer. Inside, along with more photographs and documents, was something else. A small digital recorder. The red light was blinking. Harold had been recording everything. Margaret's fingers closed around the recorder, just as Dr. Holloway turned back toward her. "I suppose you're wondering how this ends," he said conversationally. "Another tragic accident, I'm afraid. Elderly woman tries to investigate her husband's death. Falls down the stairs during a power outage. Very sad. Very believable. Except there are no stairs between here and my room," Margaret said, her hand hidden in her lap. "No, but there are stairs to the basement. And elderly people with dementia do wander." His smile was predatory. "The staff will blame themselves, of course. Should have been watching her more carefully. She been acting strange lately, talking about her dead husband, hearing voices." Margaret pressed play on the recorder, keeping the volume low. Harold's voice whispered from the tiny speaker. "Vincent doesn't know I've been documenting everything. Every bribe, every cover-up, every death. I kept copies of everything in a safety deposit box. The key is hidden in..." Dr. Holloway frowned, tilting his head. "What was that?" Margaret quickly paused the recording, but it was too late. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Harold was always too clever for his own good," he said slowly. "What else did he leave behind?" Before Margaret could respond, the lights went out. The storm had knocked out the power again, just like 3 nights ago. In the darkness, she heard Dr. Holloway curse and fumble for his phone's flashlight. Margaret had one advantage. She knew this building in the dark. She'd navigated it countless times during her sleepless nights. She quietly wheeled herself toward the door, the recorder clutched in her palm. "Mrs. Winters?" Dr. Holloway's voice was sharp. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She made it to the hallway before his flashlight beam found her. The white light caught her like a deer in headlights. She heard his footsteps moving quickly toward her. But then another light appeared at the far end of the hall. A flashlight held by someone in a security uniform. "Everything right down here," the guard called. Heard voices. Dr. Holloway's demeanor instantly shifted. "Just checking on my uncle's old room," he said pleasantly. "Making sure I hadn't missed anything when I collected his things." The guard approached, his light sweeping over Margaret in her wheelchair, and Dr. Holloway in his work clothes. "Visiting hours ended at 8, sir. And ma'am, you shouldn't be wandering around in the dark." "Of course," Dr. Holloway said. "I was just leaving." But as he moved toward the exit, Margaret made her choice. "He killed my husband," she shouted. "And Harold, he's been covering it up for 50 years. The guard's flashlight swung between them, confusion evident on his face. Dr. Holloway laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "I'm afraid Mrs. Winters has dementia," he said smoothly. "She's been having episodes lately. Very sad." "That's not true." Margaret fumbled with the recorder, trying to find the play button in the darkness. Harold recorded everything. The proof is... The recorder slipped from her trembling fingers, clattered across the floor, sliding under a nearby door. In the chaos that followed, the guard helping Margaret, while Dr. Holloway reluctantly departed, the recorder was forgotten. It wasn't until the next morning that a janitor found it and turned it into the front desk. Margaret sat in the administrator's office, listening to Harold's voice emerge from the tiny speaker with crystalline clarity. "This is Harold Brennan, recording my final confession. For 50 years, I've carried the guilt of what Vincent and I did. We killed James Winters because he discovered our corruption. We made it look like an accident, but it was murder. Cold, calculated murder. And James wasn't the first nor the last. Vincent Holloway, who now calls himself Dr. Vincent Holloway, has spent decades covering our tracks. He's eliminated witnesses, bribed officials, and destroyed evidence. I have documentation of 17 suspicious deaths over the past 5 decades, all connected to our construction and inspection business. I've kept copies of everything in Safety Deposit Box 247 at First National Bank, under the name Henry Baker, my mother's maiden name. The key is hidden inside the hollow base of my desk lamp. If something happens to me, I pray someone will find this recording and see that justice is finally done. Margaret, if you're hearing this, I'm sorry. Your husband was a good man who died for doing the right thing. I should have spoken up 50 years ago, but I was a coward. Don't let Vincent silence the truth any longer. The administrator, a young woman named Sarah, sat in stunned silence. Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks, not just for James, but for Harold, who had died trying to make amends. "We need to call the police," Sarah said finally. "We need to find that safety deposit box first," Margaret replied. "Before he does." Dr. Vincent Holloway was nothing if not thorough. Within hours of the previous night's incident, he'd used his medical credentials and forged documentation to have Margaret declared mentally incompetent. He'd also reported the recorder as stolen property, belonging to his deceased uncle's estate. But Margaret had allies now. Sarah had quietly copied the recording before the police arrived to confiscate it, and the security guard, Tom Rodriguez, had been suspicious of Dr. Holloway's story from the beginning. "Man was too calm," Tom told Margaret, as they sat in her room that afternoon. "When someone accuses you of murder, you don't just laugh it off. You get angry. You demand proof. You threaten to sue." This guy just smiled. Sarah had called in sick to work. Spent the day researching Harold Brennan's background. "I found records of a Henry Baker who rented a safety deposit box in 1975, right after your husband died. The box is still active. Rent paid annually through an automatic bank draft." Margaret gripped her wheelchair's armrests. "We have to get there before Vincent does." "About that," Tom said grimly, "I called my buddy at the bank. Dr. Holloway was there this morning, claiming to be Henry Baker's heir. They wouldn't let him access the box without proper documentation, but he seemed real interested in finding out which box it was." "Then we don't have much time," Margaret said. Sarah hesitated. "There's something else." "I looked up Dr. Holloway's practice. He specializes in elder care, specifically patients with dementia and Alzheimer's. He has access to dozens of elderly patients, many of whom have no family." The implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. How many other accidents had there been over the years? How many lonely elderly people had died with their secrets? "We're going to that bank," Margaret said with fierce determination. Tonight, breaking into a bank was easier than expected when you had a security guard with access codes and a medical administrator with official-looking documents. Sarah had forged a power of attorney, claiming Margaret was Henry Baker's legal representative, while Tom disabled the security cameras for exactly 12 minutes, long enough for them to access the safety deposit box. Inside box 247 was a treasure trove of evidence that made Margaret's blood run cold. Harold had been meticulous in his record-keeping. Photographs, financial records, insurance documents, newspaper clippings, and detailed notes spanning 5 decades. The pattern was chilling in its consistency. A worker or inspector would discover safety violations or corruption. Shortly after, they would die in an accident. Their families would receive generous settlements from Vincent's insurance company, money that bought their silence, and discouraged further investigation. But it was the most recent folder that made Margaret gasp. Inside were photographs of Sunset Manor residents who had died in the past year. All had been Dr. Holloway's patients. All had died of natural causes or minor accidents that turned fatal. "Harold figured it out," Margaret whispered. "Vincent wasn't just covering up the past. He was still killing people." Sarah picked up a document from 2023. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, 79, died after falling in the shower. But look at this. She'd been asking questions about her son's death in 1987. Her son was a construction worker. Tom examined another file. Robert Chen, 82, choked on his dinner. Had been complaining that his brother's workplace accident didn't make sense. Margaret's hand shook as she realized the scope of Vincent's operation. He hadn't just killed to cover up past crimes. He'd systematically eliminated anyone who might uncover the truth, using his medical practice as cover. "We need to get this to the FBI," Sarah said. "This is beyond local police." But as they prepared to leave, Tom's radio crackled. "Security to the main entrance. We have a Dr. Holloway here demanding access to the building." Says he's concerned about a missing patient. Margaret's blood turned to ice. He knows we're here. They had minutes, maybe less. Sarah quickly photographed the most damning documents with her phone, while Tom and Margaret gathered the physical evidence. The elevator seemed to take forever. Margaret's heart pounded as they reached the main floor. Dr. Holloway was arguing with the night security supervisor in the lobby, his polished facade beginning to crack. Margaret Winters is a confused, elderly woman with dementia, he was saying. She's wandered off before. Her medical condition makes her prone to paranoid delusions about her husband's death. I'm simply trying to ensure her safety. The supervisor looked uncertain. Sir, I understand your concern, but we can't just let people search the building without... There she is. Dr. Holloway's voice cut across the lobby like a blade. Margaret emerged from the elevator, flanked by Tom and Sarah. The safety deposit box evidence was hidden in a bag on her lap, but she could see Vincent's eyes calculating, searching for what they might have found. Mrs. Winters, he said, approaching with his hands extended, in a gesture of false concern. Thank goodness you're safe. Your behavior tonight has been very concerning. I think we need to adjust your medications. Stay away from her. Tom stepped forward, his hand resting on a security radio. Vincent's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold killer beneath. I don't think you understand the situation here. Officer Rodriguez. Mrs. Winters is my patient. She's experiencing a severe psychiatric episode, making wild accusations about murders that never happened. She needs immediate medical attention. Funny thing about that, Sarah interjected, pulling out her phone, because I just sent copies of Harold Brennan's evidence to the FBI, the state police, and 3 different news outlets, including detailed records of 17 suspicious deaths, spanning 50 years. Vincent went very still. The lobby seemed to hold its breath. That's impossible, he said quietly. Harold destroyed everything before he died. Harold was smarter than you gave him credit for, Margaret said, finding her voice. He knew you'd come for him eventually. That's why he hid the evidence where you'd never think to look. Vincent's eyes darted around the lobby, calculating escape routes. But Tom had quietly signaled his security team. The exits were now blocked. You can't prove anything, Vincent said, but his voice lacked conviction. A confused old woman and some fabricated documents won't hold up in court. Margaret reached into her bag, pulled out a photograph, one of Vincent standing over James's body 50 years ago. Harold had a very good camera, she said, and excellent night vision. For the first time in 50 years, Dr. Vincent Holloway looked genuinely afraid. The arrest made headlines across 3 states. Respected doctor charged in decades-long murder conspiracy, read the morning paper. Margaret sat in her room at Sunset Manor, reading every word with grim satisfaction. The investigation had expanded far beyond Vincent's crimes. Harold's evidence had exposed a network of corruption that reached into construction companies, insurance firms, and even government inspection agencies. Dozens of deaths previously classified as accidents were being reopened as homicides. Vincent's medical practice was raided, revealing evidence of even more recent murders. 3 other retirement home residents had died under suspicious circumstances in the past year alone, all after expressing doubts about their relatives' accidental deaths. Margaret had testified before a grand jury, her words strong and clear despite her age. She'd told them about James, about Harold, about the 50 years of wondering and waiting for answers. The prosecutor said it was the most compelling testimony he'd heard in 20 years. But it was a discovery in Harold's former room that provided the final piece of evidence. Behind the new drywall, investigators found Harold's remains. Along with a final note he'd managed to write before Vincent killed him. To whoever finds this, Vincent Holloway murdered me just as he murdered James Winters and so many others. The key to safety deposit box 247 is in my desk lamp. Tell Margaret I'm sorry it took so long, but the truth is finally coming out. Justice for James. Justice for all of them. Sarah had been promoted to facility director. One of her first acts was to install a memorial garden dedicated to Harold and James. Tom continued working security, but he'd also started a support group for families of suspicious accident victims. As for Margaret, she finally slept peacefully. The waiting was over. 1 year later, Margaret received a letter, a real one this time, delivered by the Postal Service. The return address was the state penitentiary, where Vincent Holloway awaited trial. She almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity, the same trait that had driven her to investigate Harold's disappearance, made her break the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with Vincent's precise handwriting. Mrs. Winters, I want you to know that I never intended for things to go as far as they did. Your husband's death was supposed to be an isolated incident, a regrettable necessity to protect my family and career. But secrets are like cancer. Once they start growing, they spread until they consume everything. Each new death was meant to be the last, the final cover-up that would let me live in peace. Instead, each one made the next one inevitable. Harold understood this, I think. In the end, he knew that the only way to stop the cancer was to expose it completely, even if it destroyed him in the process. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that in 50 years of nightmares, I never forgot your husband's face. He was a good man who died for trying to do the right thing. I hope that knowledge brings you some measure of peace. The trial will reveal everything. Every death, every cover-up, every life I destroyed to protect my own secrets. Justice is coming, Mrs. Winters. Your husband would be proud of what you've accomplished. Vincent Holloway. Margaret read the letter twice, then walked slowly to her window. The memorial garden was visible below, Harold's bench positioned perfectly to overlook the spot where she used to sit during her sleepless nights. She'd spent 50 years waiting for answers. Now, finally, she had them all. But as she folded the letter and placed it in her nightstand drawer, something nagged at her. Vincent's handwriting was precise, controlled, the writing of a man at peace with his fate. That night, for the first time in a year, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat by her window, staring at the moonlit courtyard, whispering to herself, because buried in Vincent's letter, between the lines of apparent confession and remorse, was something that chilled her to the bone, a subtle implication that made her realize the story wasn't over. Vincent had written, "The trial will reveal everything, every death, every cover-up, every life I destroyed." But Harold's evidence had documented 17 suspicious deaths. The FBI had linked Vincent to 23 murders. The discrepancy in numbers hadn't bothered investigators. They assumed some records were lost or incomplete. Margaret knew better. Vincent was too precise, too careful with his words. If he said the trial would reveal everything, but he'd only confessed to the crimes they could already prove, what wasn't he telling them? And more chilling still, Vincent had used present tense when describing his regrets, but past tense when discussing his murders, as if the killing was finished, complete. Margaret picked up her phone to call Detective Morrison, the FBI agent handling the case. But before she could dial, her room's phone rang. Mrs. Winters? The voice was unfamiliar, elderly, trembling. "My name is Dorothy Chan. Robert was my husband. He died at Sunset Manor last year. I think I found something you need to see." Margaret's blood ran cold. Robert Chun was one of Vincent's victims, the man who'd choked on his dinner. After asking questions about his brother's death, "What did you find?" Margaret whispered. "Letters," Dorothy Chan replied, "hidden in Robert's old desk. Letters from other people who died at your facility. They were all investigating the same thing, Mrs. Winters. And there's something else." Static crackled on the line. "Mrs. Chun, are you there?" The dial tone buzzed in Margaret's ear. Margaret sat in the darkness, her heart pounding. Vincent was in prison, awaiting trial. The murders should have stopped. But as she stared out at the memorial garden, she noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. A figure was standing by Harold's bench, motionless in the moonlight, too far away to identify, too still to be a late-night walker. The figure seemed to be watching her window. Margaret reached for her phone to call security, but the screen was black, dead battery, and the room phone, when she lifted it, gave no dial tone. Outside, the figure raised one hand. In what might have been a wave, or a warning, Margaret realized with growing horror that Vincent's letter hadn't been a confession. It had been a final clue. And somewhere in the darkness of Sunset Manor, the real killer was still hunting. The next morning, Margaret was found dead in her room. Natural causes, the coroner reported. Heart failure, common in women her age. But Sarah, now the facility director, noticed something odd. Margaret's nightstand drawer was open and empty. Vincent's letter was gone. At the trial 3 months later, Dr. Vincent Holloway was convicted of 17 murders. He received life in prison without parole. Justice, it seemed, had finally been served, but in a maximum security cell. Vincent smiled as he read the newspaper coverage. His work was done. The network he'd built over 50 years was intact. The real power behind the conspiracy remained hidden, protected by the very conviction that made him a scapegoat. And in retirement homes across 3 states, elderly residents who asked too many questions continue to die of natural causes. The last letter had served its purpose. Margaret Winters was silenced forever, and the truth, the real truth, died with her. Some secrets are too dangerous to survive.